Thank you so much for joining us today, Executive Director Berastaín. We are truly excited to have you on the Policy Chats podcast. As the Interim Executive Director for the Center for Public Impact, your work in fostering innovative solutions to societal issues is both timely and inspiring. Your journey from co-founding Caminar Latino, Latinos United for Peace and Equity, to advocating for gender-based violence prevention and restorative justice demonstrates a deep commitment to community empowerment and social equity. With over 15 years of experience in organizational management, public health, and program implementation, as well as degrees from Harvard College, Harvard Divinity School, and a doctorate in public health from UNC Gilling School of Global Public Health, your expertise is unparalleled. Today, we're eager to dive into your unique perspectives as an immigrant from Peru, your work addressing systemic challenges such as immigration, and to explore innovative approaches to shaping equitable policies in these spaces. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. And what an introduction. I'm blushing now.
Well, we are honored to have you here, and your past speaks for itself. So getting straight into the first question, can you share more about your journey as an immigrant from Peru and how those experiences have shaped your perspective on immigration policy?
Sure. My family left Peru when I was 11, and now I'm dating myself, but at the end of 98. And I grew up during the 80s and 90s when Peru was going through an internal warfare. And it was not just civil unrest, but really just almost decimation, destruction of the country. And my parents looked at the landscape, the socioeconomic, political unrest, and said, as many immigrants do, I want a better life. I want a different life for my children and something that is safer for my children. So I've often spoken about how I grew up. For me, it was normal to go to school with a pen in my hand as I was walking from my house to school. Um, but it was a pen for self-defense purposes. In case I was abducted, I would have something to stab the attacker with. Or my mom would send me, would send a bottle of water and a piece of cloth or a small towel in my backpack. And that was in case there was a gas attack or some type of smoke, I would be able to douse that towel with water and press it against my face so that I could breathe and then escape, right? And I didn't realize how abnormal that was until I came to the United States and I had distance from it. And I thought, this is just a normal behavior that a child, does as they go to school. And once you are separated, if you will, once you have distance from that reality, you realize how abnormal that is. And my parents left that context, and we went from Lima, Peru, the capital, to Dallas, Texas, suburbia of Dallas. So it was a bit of a culture shock, but it was actually quite exciting. As a child, you children are so resilient, and I think when I think back those days, my sister and I were so incredibly resilient that we just saw everything as play, right? And of course, we struggled with not knowing English. We struggled with not having any friends, but it was play, and it was through play that that we began to create our own imaginary world, if you will, in which we created a different reality for us, right? One reality that was safer, a reality that that felt warm and comfortable and close with family. And and after we left Peru, I almost kind of immediately became obsessed with the reasons that we left, the push factors and the pull factors. And of course, as a child, you don't call it that, but being the nerd that I was and am, I just wanted to understand what drives a family to just uproot. And so in middle school and in high school, I began to obsessively read about human rights and about violence and reconciliation. And then I became really obsessed in college. And so I concentrated, or I studied social anthropology and human rights. And then my divinity school, my master's, was all about violence as well. So all my education was around violence. And it was both a personal journey in understanding my my own and my family's path in terms of immigrating, as well as an academic kind of endeavor in understanding societal forces that lead to violence. And so all my career and all my studies were around violence and migration. And and the more I went into kind of my studies, I realized that domestic sexual violence, gender-based violence increases anytime you have societal unrest, increases when you have natural disasters or man-made disasters, right? And so then I found a niche in concentrating around domestic and sexual violence, and I've done work uh, around direct services, around policy, research, and then more kind of systems change type of work. So that's a little bit about kind of my journey and in immigration. And your second part of that question was, how have those experiences kind of shaped my perspective on immigration policy? And what has struck me, I think, in the last 20 years is how we either demonize or dehumanize immigrants, right? How we dehumanize that little kid who is creating his fantasy world in order to feel safer. How we dehumanize that little girl who is who might have been attacked back in her home country, right? And we dehumanize that in an effort um, to not create human-centered immigration policies. And it's not just, you know, it's not just any topic. It's a topic that it's an issue that viscerally um, affects people's lives, and and it just strikes me how um, how how we just dehumanize people in order to not make change.
Thank you so much for sharing your like personal journey along with like how you moved into immigration policy and your niches about like violence. Like it's super interesting. Just thank you for sharing that story. So I'm gonna change gears a little bit. And do you think you could tell us more about the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Justice and kind of your work with them? And after that, kind of transition to how like some of the work you did with the federal grant programs you helped establish.
Yeah, so I didn't work directly for the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Justice, but I worked for a number of organizations and grants that were directly funded by HHS and the DOJ. And one of the first ones that I worked on was called TODAS out of Boston, and it's TOD, the at sign, and the S, and it stood for Transforming Ourselves Through Dialogue, Advocacy, and Services. And it was a program that was funded again by the Department of Justice that worked to improve services and increase capacity for organizations providing services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence who were LGBTQ survivors of color. All right. So it was a very specific kind of grant. But if you go back to kind of 2011, 2012, when we got that grant, there was not a lot of research. There was not a lot that, the support for LGBTQ survivors was scant. There were only some organizations, and still there are only some organizations, few organizations that specialize on this population. And as a gay male, as an immigrant gay male, Latino immigrant gay male who wasn't documented at the time, this was super important to me because I too had experienced sexual violence, sexual assault when I was in college. And so this felt both a personally fulfilling as well as healing and professionally fulfilling project that I worked on. And it was a 3-year project out of Boston. I also there's an organization called Esperanza United, which is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. to run the National Institute on Domestic Violence in the Latinx community. And I ran that grant. And the purpose of that grant program with HHS was to build capacity all over the United States, to state coalitions, to organizations working with survivors, you name it, right? Anybody who wants assistance in improving services to work with Latinx survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. And I absolutely just love that work because it was a way to work with my community, right? It was so close to my heart. And I always say, I haven't really chosen a profession. Uh, this is not, work for me. This is a vocation. It's a calling. It lives in my being, and it's difficult to kind of separate my work and my personal passions. Because my personal story and my personal experiences have driven a lot of the work. One of the projects that I'm really proud of is helping to establish the National Center to Advance Peace for Children, Youth, and Families, or NCAP for short, under Caminar Latino and Latinos United for Peace and Equity. And this center is all about addressing the intersection of child protection and child custody when domestic violence is involved. And it's a space that's often overlooked, but it's incredibly important. And this particular center, NCAP, is funded by HHS, right? And when we look at the child welfare system, the racial disparities are just staggering, right? So, for example, Black children make up 23% of the foster care population, even though they only represent about 14% of the general population. And white children, on the other hand, right, they often receive much more favorable treatment. And so this is just a systemic issue that goes beyond individual cases, right? And child welfare involvement can be really harmful to survivors of domestic violence, no matter their background. And these systems are often really unfair and create really long-term trauma for families. And what's really frustrating is that many organizations throughout the United States are still using really outdated or mainstream approaches that don't get at the root of systemic issues or systemic problems. And it's just a reminder for me of how much work we have to do to create real meaningful change. So that's NCAP. And then the last one that I'll mention, I mean, there are others, but the last one that I'll mention is the SAFES Center. It stands for Safe Access for Victims Economic Security Center, SAFES. And this is a program funded under the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Child Support Services. And it's a demonstration initiative of 13 sites. So it's 12 states and one tribal territory that are looking at how to improve the child support system in those 13 sites to make the child support system safer for survivors of domestic violence, right? And the child support system can be terribly unsafe because it could be a survivor who is seeking child support for their children, and then the abuser, the person causing harm, might not only not provide those funds, but might retaliate because the person is seeking those funds, for instance, right? To make the explanation kind of simple. And so we're looking at ways to improve that system to make it safer and more accessible for survivors. And that's a current project that the Center for Public Impact, CPI, has with a number of other partners. And I'm really excited about that program.
Thank you so much for once again sharing part of your story. I think it's very powerful that you were able to use your experiences to, you know, turn that into good work in so many different areas and helping others who have experienced similar things or are going through similar things that you've experienced as well. I'm curious, you mentioned a lot of these identities that can kind of build upon each other to create, like, exacerbate already existing disparities. For if you're already an immigrant and you're a person of color and you're a member of the LGBTQ community and you're being marginalized for multiple different reasons, it can build up and cause a lot of extra issues and struggles for people. So, what role does intersectionality play in your work?
Hmm. Um, I don't know if intersectionality plays quote unquote a role as much as intersectionality is the work, right? It's almost like you can't do advocacy. You can't do systems change if you don't do it in an intersectional way. I mean, that is the way to do it, right? We have this concept in the gender-based violence field called creating solutions for the last girl. And it's a concept that comes from this notion of if you create services for the most marginalized, right? So think about, for instance, a person who is sex trafficked, who has a disability, who might not speak English, who is also an immigrant, or who might not speak the mainstream language, right? If you cover for all of those kind of identities, you will also cover for the person who does speak English, who does not have a disability, right? Who is a citizen of that country, right? So you create systems for the people on the outer circles, if you will, or the most marginalized. The last girl is the concept. So you do create services and responses, systemic responses in an intersectional manner, and that's what I mean by that is the work, right? And it's a little bit hard for me to, for instance, to detangle my Latinx immigrant identity from my gay identity. And I know that, they're not one and the same, but or my religious upbringing, right? So I remember when I was a kid, I would go to church and I would hear the priest say, if you commit a sin, if you are a liar, if you murder, if you steal, if you are gay, and yes, gay was grouped with all of those other sins, if you will, right? Then Jesus died for no reason because you're committing these sins, and you are essentially um, putting another nail on baby Jesus's hands and feet. And so I remember as a child, I would go home and I would take a pencil, I would sharpen it, and I would press it against my hand, right? Because until it hurt too much, because it was a way for me to be in community with Jesus, right, who died for my sins. It's the message that you're getting as a child. So that was kind of part of my religious upbringing. But I also look at my religious community in the United States and in Peru who supported my family as immigrants. Those were the ones who gave us, right, the mattress in which we slept, right, the television, right, food, right, and things are much more complex than just one dimension of good or bad. And so as I think about my identity, I think about those complexities and the reality that those complexities exist for absolutely everyone. And this is why, because people live complex lives, solutions can't just be distilled to black and white binaries, or simple answers.
Thank you so much. I love the way you said that, how people live complex lives, so you're not going to necessarily have a simple solution. It's going to probably end up leaving important populations out of that. Um, Kind of transitioning back a bit more to immigration policy. You have talked a lot about collaborations and different funding opportunities through organizations. What role do collaborations between local governments and federal agencies play in creating these systemic solutions for immigration policy challenges?
Mm. Well, we're not seeing a lot of collaboration, in my opinion, in terms of positive collaborations that are happening between local and federal agencies. We're seeing a lot of a hard hammer coming down on local governments that are establishing sanctuary spaces, for example, right, or are protecting immigrants. And there are conversations around defunding those local communities, for instance, or police departments, etc. Um, but we're not really seeing strong local federal agency collaborations that are for the benefit of immigrants, right? There are collaborations to punish immigrants, to deport them, to persecute and prosecute them. But there are some some initiatives that I see at a number of local levels that are quite inspiring. So, for example, I'll talk a little bit about the city of Denver, which I don't work with the city of Denver, but I heard Mike Johnson, Mayor Johnson, the mayor of Denver, um, talk about an initiative that his city had done. So as you know, let me just back up. As you know, the governor of Texas and other governors were just sending, putting immigrants on a bus and sending them to different cities. And Denver became one of those cities that was that received a large number of immigrants, because a bus ticket to Denver is much cheaper than a bus ticket to New York or Boston, right? So Denver immediately saw this influx of immigrants who were just in encampments, right? I mean, it was a dire situation. And I remember Mayor Johnson saying, we have all these immigrants, people are upset. At the same time, I'm having business leaders, both MAGA business leaders and Democrat business leaders, saying, Mayor Johnson, Mike, what can we do? I mean, we have hundreds of jobs open in our communities, in our companies, in our businesses. Why can't we just employ some of these immigrants, right? And so this is like bipartisan interest in fixing the issue, right? And so his administration looked at all these cases, and the majority of them were coming from Venezuela, is what he mentioned, and they were seeking asylum. And he said, if you the normal or typical right now asylum case, there's a backlog, right? So that asylum case will get to the court in 7 to 9 years, right? So if you arrive right now, your asylum court case will be in 2031, 2032. However, if you proactively apply for asylum, that you get a work permit within 180 days, right? You can get a work permit. So what the Johnson administration in Denver said, what Mayor Johnson said was, why don't we create a job readiness program in which we use their waiting period of 180 days, look at the jobs that our community desperately needs in these businesses, right? And upskill immigrants to take those jobs once their work permits arrive and while they're waiting for their final decision on their asylum case. So this is just a beautiful example of creative thinking and problem solving, systems thinking, right? They employed an army of volunteer lawyers to help file these cases in Denver. They established a job readiness program for capacity building, and they began to staff folks who were receiving work permits in the community in Denver, right? So when you have a situation in which you have an influx of migrants, a community, a city that is clamoring for folks to fill those jobs, and you have an administration that is looking at the problem as an opportunity and thinking systemically, you get a solution like the one in Denver, right? And what would it be for this kind of model to be replicated across the country, right? It gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think it's a great example that you mentioned with Denver. And I know that some other areas have, at times done semi-similar things. We had California State Senator Smallwood Cuevas on the podcast a while
Mm.
back, and she talked about some initiatives they were working on. I can't remember the bill number off the top of my head, but to create workforce development programs in and help create a pipeline for people whose jobs might be shifting due to technology progressing and everything changing, so that they have jobs in fields that are more environmentally friendly and they could still maintain jobs to about their family. But the Denver program that you outlined, it's amazing that they're able to take an unforeseen situation, such as, just one day randomly realizing you're going to be receiving a bunch of buses of immigrants with no, home, no help with any plans for how to figure out what's happening, and to turn that into an opportunity that not only helps the city of Denver, I'm sure, but also all of
Mhm.
these immigrants and their families. Um, I'm curious, you mentioned, asylum and taking 7 to 9 years to get processed. I know a lot of the immigration system in the US has a lot of legal hurdles and they're very time consuming. Is there any solution you see in the future to help, you know, ease up the burden on our legal system so that it's not affecting the immigrants so adversely that they're waiting these long periods of time and are in these limbo periods where they're in the process of maybe becoming legal immigrants or getting employment authorization, but they just can't get it?
That's a tough question to answer, right? Because part of the answer is resources. Part of the answer is prioritization, right? And we have an incoming administration that is diverting resources from adjudicating this asylum cases to what the administration has indicated will be mass deportations. And so uh, I'm not sure if I have a really nice, good answer or hopeful answer on that. Because realistically, I take people at their word. And what I'm hearing at the national level right now is an administration that doesn't want to create policies and processes that necessarily center immigrants. Um, on one hand. On the other hand, I have heard recent new kind of shifts in language that are positive, right, from the incoming administration in saying, hey, we want to look at immigrants who are skilled, right, who have graduated from university, right, and figure out ways to keep those folks here, right? We want to look at DACA, which I was a DACA recipient myself, right? And so we're seeing what's going to happen in the next 6 months, year, 4 years, right? But what I heard during the election cycle didn't make me hopeful. What I'm hearing now, it's like, okay, well, maybe there is an opportunity here for a little more nuance. Um, but I'm an optimist at heart, and I remain cautiously optimistic. But um, there's not a lot for me to work on right now to remain optimistic.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So this next question kind of wraps in what we were talking about with the Denver Initiative program and these bipartisan communities that are coming together. It's really great that that's available. But what are some of the biggest conceptions that you've kind of perceived about immigrants that stifle or affect policy that makes it more difficult for reform and et cetera?
Um, we talked a little bit about this earlier, right? That there is a demonization and dehumanization of immigrants. When we say that immigrants are in the national kind of dialogue, we say immigrants are murderers and they're rapists and they're drug mules and they're sending their criminals and they're sending their insane people to the United States. You create an embedded narrative in the psyche of the population that the more you repeat it, the more you begin to believe it. And so when then you try to create policies that are smart, responsive, adaptive, thoughtful, you've almost created your own enemy, right? So you've created your own enemy because you have taught people to think about immigrants in a certain way. So now when you try to fix the issue, you're going to get a lot of pushback with the same rhetoric that you utilized, that you taught people to use, right? And so what really worries me is the narratives that we use to create a persona, to create a character, create the contours of evil that is an immigrant in the minds of people, right? And this is why immigrants who share their stories, right? I take my hat off to young folks who are so and I used to be there, but who put themselves out there and tell their stories, because that actually does change hearts, right? I remember when I quote unquote came out as an undocumented immigrant when I was in college and in grad school. Um, I had people who actually reached out and said, this is changing the way that I think about immigrants, right? I remember having the mom of a best friend of mine in high school say, that we should treat immigrants the way we treat furniture, just put them back in a box and ship them back, right, from where they came. And after I published an op-ed around my coming out story, she reached out to me and and we had a heart-to-heart and a different kind of conversation about immigration that was more nuanced. And so I still believe that hearts and minds can be changed through um, personal interactions and knowing who is behind a word like immigrant, right? And it's people like you and me. Um, and so I remain hopeful that stories can change the world. And I'm thinking here too, and you didn't ask me about this, but I'm thinking about the organizations that are combating these misconceptions and not just combating, but also trying to create the social conditions or the systemic conditions that ensure safety. I mean, we're talking about basic human rights safety, right, for people, in this case, immigrants. I'm on the board of an organization called ImSchools, and the organization specializes on training schools and teachers on becoming safer spaces for children, for students, right? This is a noble cause. This is not a partisan issue. I mean, we want children to be educated. We want children to go to school and feel safe. We want children to have spaces where they can learn without worrying, um, whether they're going to be deported. And we have teachers and schools who want to know how to do that properly for children. And so organizations like ImSchools are at the forefront of battling these misconceptions, changing them, and more importantly, imagining spaces that um, that can be life affirming.
Yeah. So thank you again for your insights. You talked about how politicians like use their rhetoric to demonize immigrants, and it kind of hurts them later in the entire government system because that same rhetoric that they used come back to like bite us in the butt because the people start using bad like wrong narratives. How do you think like me and Rachel or students along with like who want to, help these issues of like stigma around immigrants, like what could we do? People who are motivated to help but aren't sure how.
I think one of the best attributes that I see in students is this uh, unapologetic curiosity, right? You have an ability to ask questions of why, how did we get here, but why does it have to work this way, right? That some people who might become jaded later on might no longer have the creativity and sometimes the courage to ask those questions. And that's one of the things that makes young people um, so incredible and also so frustrating, right? So frustrating because you don't want to be questioned, but so incredible because when you are willing as an adult, as a not an adult, as an older person, to be questioned, and you're willing to grapple with the questions that are before you, that can help shift things, right? So I think that young folks have this uncanny ability to ask really thoughtful questions that come from a real place of curiosity and love. That I hope that you and Rachel and folks like you would lean into. What I see that becomes your Achilles heel sometimes is that, and not you, but but students, is that they ask questions um, masked in the sense of in the veil of curiosity, but you've already come to an answer, right? It's like, no, you come to the table with like, no, you're already wrong, right? Made up your mind that the person's wrong. And I'll tell you this, um, I have worked with people who are anti-abortion, who are anti-gay marriage, who are anti-immigrant, right? And I've broken bread with them, right? I've been friends with these folks, and part of I think how we got there is that, and this takes a gargantuan effort, is to suspend my belief that I am right and to truly understand their position, like truly, right? From their point of view, from their lived experience, because I'm trying them to understand my position from my point of view and my lived experience. And I can't ask that of them if I don't give that reciprocity. It doesn't mean that I'll agree at the end, but you enter the conversation in a different way um, when you don't try to convince someone that your way or your answer is the right one, but rather you approach it through a truly curious lens.
That's amazing. I think that's something that we benefit from here at UCR, especially that our students come from so many diverse backgrounds. In my 3 years here, I've got the opportunity to meet such a variety of students. And like you mentioned, learning to put yourself in their shoes and learn from their experiences and see, what shaped the way that they are today, I think can be so thought-provoking and powerful. Um,
But is it
so
frustrating too?
I think when you're talking with someone who like has like points out things that, you were hoping wouldn't be brought up, I think it's definitely frustrating. And I don't think it's like you mentioned, an easy thing to overcome. So I think it's very amazing that you're able to do it. I know it's not the easiest thing.
Well, but there is also an element of knowing boundaries, right, and self-care, right? So, trust me, I'm not able to do it all the time. I mean, there are plenty of people who piss me off with things, so I have to be at the right space to do that, right? And I think that what I've learned is I want to be curious, but I'm not always in the space to be curious. And so my boundary is when I know I'm not in a space to be curious, I have a choice to not engage and remove myself from that conversation and only enter a conversation if I'm really curious. And I think that's a learning that I've had to like force myself to learn, if you will, because otherwise you burn out. Because otherwise you're battling people who are coming with these crazy ideas or what you think are crazy ideas, right? Um, and that's just not healthy. So um, yeah, I sympathize with that. It is exhausting, and so I guess my tip is really know how to navigate those boundaries.
That's amazing. That's a great tip because it can definitely, as you said, be mentally draining a bit to kind of always be in that mindset. Um, Kind of as we're starting to wrap up the podcast, to shift back, you started to talk about the upcoming presidency, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how immigration policies in the US have changed across different presidencies, you know, in
Mm.
this past 21st century, and what lessons can we learn from those?
Wow, you're making me think back to the George W. Bush era in the early 2000s, right? I mean, and I think this will link to your other question around what happens after 2024. So yeah, immigration policies have seen significant shifts across different presidencies in the last, 25 years, and those policies have often reflected the political and social priorities of those years, right? So under George W. Bush, immigration policy focused really heavily on national security after 9/11. And that came with measures like the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and stricter border enforcement, right? And at the same time, you had bipartisan efforts at comprehensive immigration reform, although they ultimately failed to pass, right? So, but I remember there was a huge push around the DREAM Act at the time, right? That the first DREAM Act, if you will, was out of Texas. And if you can imagine that, right? It came out of the suburbs of Dallas where youth went to the Texas Capitol and talked about their stories. And you had Republican and Democrat lawmakers crying, after hearing those stories, and they passed um, the first DREAM Act, if you will, that allowed for in-state. At the time, it was allowing for in-state tuition for undocumented students, right, and allow students to go to college, and that these kids, that's all they wanted to do, right? And so there were efforts to take that to the national level, and then there were other states that started replicating that. But Senator Durbin at the time was pushing for this for this to happen. And believe it or not, Senator Lindsey Graham was also at the forefront of that, and now you wouldn't imagine that. So that was, during the Bush era. Then came the Obama administration, and I would say that the Obama administration sought a bit of a more, I don't know if I would call it a balanced approach, but it emphasized enforcement and protection, you could say. And deportations, to be fair, increased tremendously during his first term. And the administration was called, Obama was called the deporter in chief at the time, right? And he's had, the number of deportations he's had were more than Trump did during the first term. But President Obama also introduced DACA, right? The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which provided temporary relief to undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States as children, right? And I was a beneficiary of DACA. But the broader immigration reforms that the administration was trying to push were often blocked by Congress. Then enters the Trump administration in 2016, and that marks a shift, a stark shift, I would say, towards restrictionist policies, right? And so this period ends up seeing a family separation at the border, travel ban, predominantly targeting Muslim countries, and then a significant reduction in refugee admissions, right? And using the public health emergency, the pandemic, to say we've entirely closed our borders. And then immigration courts and asylum processes became even more backlogged. And this just created just devastating, lasting impacts on the system. And now under President Biden, we've seen efforts to reverse some of those restrictive policies, like ending the travel ban and reuniting families separated at the border. But there's challenges that persist, especially with asylum policies and the handling of just record numbers of immigrants at the southern border. And the administration has also faced quite a bit of criticism for continuing some of the Trump era enforcement measures, like Title 42, which used, again, the public health concerns and the public health emergencies to restrict asylum claims. So as I reflect on kind of the trajectory of the 21st century policies in immigration, I think a key lesson from these shifts is the need for consistent, humane, and comprehensive immigration policy, right? And swinging between extremes is what has created uncertainty and suffering for millions of people. And it just highlights the limitations of executive action, right, in addressing really complex issues that really require legislative solutions. It really requires Congress to step in. So immigration reform becomes an act of balancing security, economic needs, and human rights. And the political will to find that balance, unfortunately, has often been missing. To your question around what happens after the 2024 election, 25 on, I want to remain hopeful. Right? That we can have the political will to balance those pieces, like security, right? National security, economic needs, human rights, center people. I want to remain hopeful. But like I said earlier, the rhetoric that I hear doesn't give me a lot to work with.
Thank you so much. I think that right there is a great place to end the podcast. I think we've seen a lot of shifting immigration policy over the past presidencies, as you mentioned, and with an incoming president coming in just less than a couple weeks, there's definitely, I'm sure, going to be a lot of changes. And I share the same standpoint as you in that I hope that, the messaging that we've been receiving more recently remains and that we can stay hopeful. But earlier you did mention that you do something where you take off your hat to those who share their stories about their experiences as immigrants or maybe as marginalized communities. And I want, on behalf of myself and Liam, to take our hats off to you because truly sharing your story and then translating that into great, meaningful work in so many different fields and so many different areas to help all of these communities is truly like we've never seen before. So, you know, and your teachings on how people can live these complex lives and we need to create these complex and comprehensive and reliable solutions to all of these issues are very important. So, with that, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been such an honor to speak with you and to learn from your insights, and we really appreciate it.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
This podcast is a production of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and our theme music was produced by Veer Sinha. For the latest updates on the School of Public Policy, be sure to check us out at UCR_SPP on Instagram, or for more episodes and content, visit our YouTube channel. I'm Rachel Strassman. Till next time.